Before we start this video, a large thank you to Yug King, Donato, Georg, Zoo, Andre, a name I unfortunately cannot pronounce. Thank you for the support, my friend, and James for their support on Patreon. I hope you guys enjoy the video. Hello everybody, quick note before we start. If you find your camera movement is kind of like snappy instead of smooth, make sure you have the right stick for camera movement set to analog and not digital. I might have not recorded that when I was actually making the episode. So again, just change this right here to analog, not digital, and you should be good to go. Okay, so over here, this is my Project Nephilim. You can see we jump up in the air, then we land, and if we move while we're jumping, we get some distance on the jump. And also, if we were to jump off a high place, we fall faster and faster and faster until we hit the ground. So let's recreate this in our project. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is clean up these scripts from the last episode. I'm going to drag them into the folders they belong in. I'm going to make a new folder called UI inside the scripts folder for the UI match scroll wheel to selected button. And I'm going to drag the character profile picture into the UI sprites folder. All right, so you can use free animations to this. I will link some in the description. You might have to split them up because we're going to do this in 4 segments: start, lift, idle, and end. So here's a start animation, and right what we want to do is basically apply jumping height right here at the beginning of the lift animation. This is when you actually start rising in velocity. And then the idle will just repeat until you land, or the jump ends. And then obviously the ending segment will be when you actually touch the ground. So we're going to need to set up a few things for this. So before we actually make the jump itself, or rather before we actually hook up the jump's logic, we need to create a system to detect if we're grounded or not. And here's how it looks all together, by the way. This is just a jumping animation with all parts combined. But yeah, we need to make a system to detect if we're grounded or not, as well as a system to basically apply some force if we're in the air. So let's go to the animator and start hooking up our jumping animations before we get started with that. And if you have any of our weapon animation packs, then these do all come with the jumping animations. I will link the asset store page in the description, as well as a free alternative. So I'm going to drag all these in here. We have the jump start, then the jump lift, the jump idle, and the jump end. Now I'm going to rename these to main jump start, main jump lift, main jump idle, and main jump end, because in the future, we're also going to have a two-handed version for if you are two-handing your weapon. So just going to quickly go through all these and rename them in no particular order. So I'm just going to rename them all to the main keyword. And while I'm doing that, I'm going to talk about what we're going to do. So we're going to utilize animation parameters to basically move the character between certain animations for us, depending on what state the animator's in. What do I mean by that? Well, we're going to keep track of, say, for example, is grounded. And if the is grounded parameter on the animator is turned to true, then we're going to automatically move to the jump end animation state. We're going to do that by using some transition arrows. So I'm going to show you. Let's right click main jump, make transition, and put the first one to lift. Now click on this arrow. What you want to do is set the end time to 1 and the transition duration to 0, and that'll just move between animation and animation. But if you want to, you can apply a bit of a blend so it's not so abrupt. You can do this by just moving these 2 arrows here, or you can go up and edit these values manually. I'm going to say maybe 0.95 and 0.05. or even 0.9 and 0.1. That's a pretty smooth animation transition. So whatever you want to set up with it will be fine. It's going to depend on your animations and how you want it to look genuinely. So I'm just going to set mine to 0.9 and 0.1 for now. We can tweak that later if we want to. Next, let's go to the lift animation here. And we're going to make a transition to both the idle and also the end. Let's start with the idle. Now, what we want to do is keep on has exit time. We want that. That's important on the last animation as well. Again, 0.9 and 0.1, but let's make a new parameter now for a bool. Let's call it is grounded. And what we want to do now is make a transition from lift to end, because let's say for some reason you hit the ground before the lift animation is complete. We want to go right to the end. Let's make a condition for is grounded is true and uncheck has exit time, so this happens instantly. I'm going to set transition duration to 0.1 again, and now we should be good to go. Next, let's make a transition from the idle to the end and on tick has exit time and make the condition for is grounded has to be true. I'm going to make the transition duration 0.1 and then make a transition to the empty from the end. And again, you can make the exit time whatever you want. I'm going to keep has exit time, make the transition duration 0.1. So let's go to our player controls now and let's just duplicate basically one of the actions that we have here, dodge or sprint. So right click, duplicate that. I'm going to rename this one to jump. I'm going to remove the tap interaction because this is just when we press it. We don't want any special interaction for this. And I'm going to change the button from button east on the gamepad, which is B on the Xbox controller, to button south on the gamepad, which is typically A on the Xbox controller. I believe it's X on the PlayStation controller. And then we're going to save that. Now let's go set up our inputs on our input manager. So where we have player action input, let's make a serializable field for a bool jump input. Let's initialize that at false. And then let's make the functionality to actually toggle this to true. So on enable, like any of our previous inputs, we reference it using our player controls .player actions .jump .performed plus equals I, jump input is equal to true. Now let's make our functionality to actually do something when this input is pressed. So let's say private void handle jump input. And now that I see this, I'm going to rename my handle sprinting to handle sprinting input to keep my naming conventions the same. You don't need to do this. I just enjoy keeping everything the same in terms of naming conventions. So what are we going to do under handle jump input? Well, the same thing we usually do. We're going to say if jump input is equal to true, we're going to initialize it to false instantly, so it's not running this code multiple times. And then we're going to make an attempt to run the jumping function. We're also going to make a to-do note here in the future to say if we have a UI window open, simply return without doing anything. We don't want to allow our player to jump if they are in a menu because they're probably using this button for something else. So then I'm going to say attempt to perform a jump, or I'll keep it in all caps to keep the conventions the same again, attempt to perform jump. So we're going to say player.player locomotion manager. And if we type attempt, you see we have attempt to perform dodge. So let's just copy that there and just erase this and say jump. This function doesn't exist yet, so let's go make it. Now under the player locomotion manager, let's copy attempt to perform dodge and paste it and change dodge to jump. And let's see what we can reuse here. So we can reuse if player is performing action return. We can reuse the stamina check for if it's 0 return. Let's just delete everything below that and let's start writing some stuff. So what are we going to do? Well, we're going to basically lose some stamina for doing this. And we're going to want to play an animation. So we can actually take the stamina drain as well. I forgot that from here. Player.player network manager.current stamina dot value minus equals the jump stamina cost, which is a variable we have to make now as well. So let's go make a variable for the jump stamina cost. And let's copy dodge stamina cost, paste it, change it to jump. And for now, I will keep it rather at 25. We can play with those values in the future. That's more of a balanced thing anyway. So right on top of that, I'm going to say if the player dot is jumping, we want to return. We don't have this made yet, but if we're already jumping, we don't want to jump again. Otherwise, you could spam jump and fly into the air infinitely. If we are not grounded, we want to return. We don't want to be able to jump if we're already floating in the air for some reason. So if we aren't grounded, we also return. I'm going to say if we are performing an action, we do not want to allow a jump. But I'm going to put a bracket here because in the future, or I'm going to say general action, and I'm going to put a bracket here and say will change when combat is added. And this is because we can still be mid-jump when attempting a jumping attack. So this will be mostly the same, but it might need some minor adjustments when we circle back around after jumping attacks and all that good stuff. So I'm going to say if we are out of stamina, we do not wish to allow a jump. If we are already jumping, we do not wish to allow a jump. And if we are not grounded, we do not wish to allow a jump, because otherwise what are you going to jump from? You'd be pushing up from the air, and that doesn't make sense. So I'm going to say if we're already in a jump, we want to basically wait for the current jump to finish. And if we are not grounded, we do not want to allow a jump. All right, so what's next? Well, let's go make these bools. So we have is jumping and is grounded. Let's go to the character manager, because these are going to be pretty universal across every character in the game, whether it be AI or player. Let's go into flags, and we can actually put it right below is performing action. So let's make a public bool for is grounded and is jumping. And I'm going to initialize is jumping as false, and I'm going to initialize is grounded as true. Now this technically doesn't matter because the ground check will correct this immediately if it's false, but I'm just going to initialize it as true because everything in the scene typically starts grounded. I'm going to say if we are two-handing our weapon, play the two-handed jumping animation, otherwise play the one-handed jumping animation. And this is a to-do note for the future. We're going to do this when we add in two-handing our weapon. This is going to come further down the road. So I'll put a bracket here to say to-do. For now, though, let's just say player.player animator manager dot play target action animation, and we want to play the jumping animation. I believe we call that main underscore jump underscore 01. Now where it says is performing action, we want to say false for now. And the reason being is because in the future, again, we want to be able to attack while we're in a jumping animation. And we're also going to allow movement, albeit a lot slower if we're in the air falling. So we're going to say that is false. Now, let's say player.isJumping is equal to true. And then we're going to save that and minimize. Then right below that, let's make a public void apply jumping velocity. Remember I said we're going to apply velocity at a certain point in the animation? Well, we're going to use animation events for that. And at a specific animation, we're going to basically apply some upward velocity. So let's make a comment, apply an upward velocity. Now, how are we going to do that? So this is going to also be depending on forces on our game. What do I mean by that? Well, we're going to have a force of gravity that's constantly pushing down on us, basically. So let's actually make that first. It's much easier to do this and to demonstrate and then to come back to this. So let's go to the character locomotion manager because this is the base class. And what we're going to do now is write some grounding logic and some falling logic if we're not grounded. So I'm going to make a header. I'm going to call this grounded. Actually, I'm going to call it ground and jump, or ground and jumping. You can call it ground check and jumping. That's perhaps a better title for it. As long as you know what it does, that's all that matters. It's going to be options for our ground check, our falling, and our jumping. So let's make a serializable field protected vector 3, y velocity. What is this for? Well, I'm going to make a comment so it's instantly clear and we're not wondering because that is a little bit ambiguous. I'm going to say this is the force at which our character will basically be pulled up or down. So think of falling and jumping. This force is always going to be active in the scene, even if you're grounded. It's going to be sticking you to the ground. Because it's like in real life, if you're walking around, there's always a force. If you try to jump, you're being pulled back down instantly. You're seeking ground again. So what we want to do is make it so our character is always just kind of stuck to the ground. That way they don't float off of things when they run off of them. So let's add a protected float, grounded y velocity, minus 20. This is the force at which our character is sticking to the ground whilst they are grounded. And again, this will stop them from being floaty. If they are running over things, it'll keep them stuck to the ground, which is a much nicer gameplay feel. So let's make a protected float again for fall starts y velocity. I'm going to initialize this at minus 5. What does this do? Well, instead of having us start off at minus 20, we're going to start off at minus 5, and it's going to incrementally get faster and faster. You don't need to do this, but I find it's a much nicer effect because it basically allows you to have a more floaty fall at first. And it feels cooler in action RPGs, in my opinion. Now, if you don't want this, you don't need to use it at all. But I like it a lot, and I use this in my game as well. I believe most games that are in the action RPG genre jumping kind of use this as well. So I'm going to make a protected bool for falling velocity has been set is equal to false. Why am I doing that? Because whenever we start a new fall, we're going to change that to true and start us off at the falling start velocity. So let's make a protected float for the in-air timer to keep track of how long we've been in the air. This will come into play in this video, but also in later videos for other things we will add to this. And let's make a protected void handle ground check. Now, let's reference the character manager by making a character manager variable up top. On awake, we'll say character is equal to get component character manager because this rests on the same game object as the character manager. We're going to say character.isGrounded is equal to, and this is very simple, we're going to just use a physics dot check sphere, and we're going to put it at the position of our character by saying character transform.position, and then we're going to put it a radius of, we'll say 1 for now, but we're going to change that immediately, and a layer mask of 0, but again, we're going to change that immediately. So let's make variables for this because I don't like using magic numbers. They're dangerous. Let's basically come up here and make a serializable field for a float. Let's call this ground check sphere radius. Let's initialize this to say 1, but we're definitely going to change it. And let's make a serializable field layer mask for the layer of the ground. Let's just call this ground layer. So what is this doing? It's basically checking a sphere on the specified layer at this radius. So putting ground radius here and then the ground layer here. So it's going to check in the radius of the sphere for anything on this layer. And if it touches this layer, it will come back as true. And if it doesn't touch this layer, it comes back as false. And in update, we say handle ground check. So I'll show you this in action, but so we can actually see it too. Let's go down here and say protected void on gizmos selected, and let's say gizmos dot draw sphere and then pass the transform position and the ground sphere radius. What does this do? If you select this player object, it will draw a sphere for us in the scene view with this dimension of the ground sphere radius. So we can actually see the size of our ground sphere, and we can know how big to make it depending on our character size. Now let's go into the game and go and look at the player prefab. Let's go over to the player locomotion manager, set the ground layer to default right here because most objects have the default layer in our scene. And just to make sure, we can actually go into the scene and change it. And make sure your character is no longer the default layer or else you'll bring up in your own character for ground check. So let's make a new layer for the character. Let's call it character. And then let's go to the player prefab again and go to their layer that we just had up there in the top right. And click this and change it to character and click yes, change every children to the layer of character. Now, if you go into the scene here, you can see my player's ground check spheres. You can see it's massive. That's 1. So this is what on Draw Gizmos does for us. We can visualize it now, which is very handy. Now, if I change this, we want it about maybe 0.3 just on the outer edges of our feet. And that looks good. So you can see here we are grounded. Now, watch what happens if I remove the floor. I'm going to untick this hand so I can grab the floor in the scene view again. And this basically take it away. And if I go back to our character, we are no longer grounded. Now, we're not falling yet, but you can see the ground check does work as is intended. Now, if I go back and turn this plane on again, you can see that we do, in fact, become grounded. So anything inside the sphere with a ground layer that has a collider will basically return true for us. Now, let's go to the handle ground check on the update. And we're going to say right below that, if character is grounded, then we want to do some logic. We're going to first say if y velocity dot y is less than 0. Why are we saying this? Well, we want to make sure that we're not jumping because if it's higher than 0, that means we're trying to jump because we're moving upward. So we don't want to do this if we're jumping. If we are not attempting to jump or move upward, then we run this logic. So if the character is not grounded and we're not jumping upwards, in-air timer is equal to 0. Falling velocity has been set is equal to false. And then we're going to simply say y velocity dot y is equal to grounded y velocity. So if we're moving around the ground, we're always going to have that grounded velocity, which will be minus 20, I believe I said it to. And it'll make us stick to the ground more. Now, else, if we are not grounded, if the character dot is not jumping and our falling velocity has not been set yet, then we're going to set our y velocity to that falling velocity. So I'm going to make a comment here so it's very clear. If we are not jumping and our falling velocity has not been set yet. So you don't have to use this, but all this does again is it starts off our fall slower and ramps up the speed over time because it starts us off at a slower number so we don't fall instantly extremely fast. So I'm going to say falling velocity has been set is equal to true. Y velocity dot y is equal to the falling start velocity. Okay. Now, below this, we're going to say in-air timer is equal to in-air timer plus time dot delta time. This just keeps track of how long we've been in the air. Or you can say in-air timer plus equals time dot delta time if you prefer shorthand. I'm just going to keep it the other way. It just is preference. Really, it's all the same. Right below that, I am going to say y velocity dot y plus equals gravity force times time dot delta time. What is gravity force? We haven't made it yet. So this is going to be basically how quickly you're going to be pulled down. So I'm going to make a serializable field float. Gravity force is equal to minus, I'll say 5.55. We're probably going to increase that a whole lot. I don't remember what I had for my other project, but I think it was relatively high, so we'll tweak that when we go into the game. Then I'm going to say character controller dot move, and then we're going to pass the y velocity times time dot delta time. So you should always be moving regardless if you're falling or not, basically. Now let's go into the game here. I'm going to make sure this is all set to default layer, everything in my construct. I'm going to change all children by doing this in the main game object, save it, go back into the game here. And now I'm just going to go over to my character and run around to a panel. And I'm going to untick the plane and you'll see I start falling. So cool, that's working as intended. Except we're falling and we're looking pretty chill about it. So let's actually make a falling animation. I'm going to add a float for the in-air timer. And the reason why I'm doing this is because you have two options here. So we don't want to play the falling animation all the time because what happens if you fall off a tiny, tiny little drop? You're just going to stick to the ground. You don't want to play a falling animation. So I'm going to basically make it so we're going to check for how long we've been in the air. And if we're in the air for longer than 0.1 seconds, we're going to play a falling animation. Going to drag in this animation, call it falling 01, and I'm going to put it up here and make a transition from the empty to this falling 01 animation. I'm going to make the conditions that I have to be not grounded, and the in-air timer has to be greater than, we'll say, 0.25 or 0.1 or 0.5. Basically, how long do you want to be in the air before you begin playing the falling animation? Now, the other option is to check for a raycast, and to check if the height is larger than X feet below you, then start playing the falling animation instantly and create a flag on the animator. If you want me to do that instead, let me know in the comments. I can show both. Both are valid ways of doing it. I just like this one personally. So I'm going to go to the falling and make a transition back to the jump end and make sure we're grounded and make it instant. Now, back on the update function here, I'm just going to simply say character.animator.setFloat, and we're going to set the in-air timer to whatever the in-air timer is here. Okay, looks good. I think so anyway. We'll know when I start testing it. So I'm going to save that again, and I'm just going to move this around so it looks a bit neater. Cool, jump back into the project. Going to go to my scenes folder, going to go to the world folder here, and I'm going to basically just make a little diving board or a place to fall from. So I'm just going to call this, I'll create an empty game object, zeroed out, and call it high dive. And I'm just going to create a cube inside of it, and I'm going to bring it up a few feet so we can just see that we're falling, it's working, the ground check works, the landing animation works. I basically just want to make sure that all these state transitions are working as intended. That's all. Okay, so that's probably high enough. I'm going to find my floor material. I can't remember what I called it. Maybe it was floor, maybe it was prototype material. Okay, yeah, probably floor. All right, so now that I have this with material on it, I'm going to create an empty game object on it. I'm going to call this player transform. I'm just going to drag it a little bit above it. I'm going to see if I can just basically parent the player under that when I come back to the scene. So we have a mistake here. As you can see, I'm floating around. That looks kind of funny. This is because although I am grounded in the animator, I'm never changing my isGrounded bool to match my player. So if I tick that, you can see I do become grounded. So let's fix that right away. Let's go to the character manager on the update function. And in the future, this is where we're going to have all of our flags basically being fed to our animator or reset if we need to. So I'm going to say animator.setBool. I'm going to say isGrounded, just like that. And then save. And now if I go back to the game, it is working as intended. Now, if I potentially copy the transform of this game object I made, I might be able to hook the player up there. It might not work though. So let's right click this, copy component. And then if I paste here, probably should have copied the world position. Paste component values. Yeah, definitely should have copied the world position. You know what, let's drag them up there. It's easier. So as you can see, the ground check sphere is massive, so I'm floating. That's not supposed to be that way. Let's make it to 0.3. You should always apply this to your prefab, so it actually applies when you restart the game. I'll do that shortly. Let's fall and see what happens. Okay, so I'm falling, and that is kind of slow, but it works as intended. So let's go to the player prefab. Let's change the ground force, or gravity force rather. I'm going to change mine to say -40, and I'm going to make the radius for the ground check sphere 0.3. All right, looks good. If we go back in the scene here now and jump off, this should work, and it did not. So let's check our animator and see what's up. And I think it might be a transition. Yes, it is. Untick has exit time from empty to falling 01, so it's instant if the timer is met. And just this little box right here, untick that. That just makes it transition instantly if these conditions are met. Now, if I go back in the scene, it plays and then plays landing animation. That is awesome, working as intended. So we have a little bit more work to do on this yet. But first, if you're like me and you put some code in the wrong place, you can probably see that we're floating off of the ground because of this check sphere. That is simply because we should always be applying a downward force whether or not we are grounded or not, and we're not doing that unless we're in the air because we put this in the wrong place. So copy the, or I should say I put it in the wrong place, copy the character.charactercontroller.move and move it outside the if and else statement. There should always be some force applied to your character, pulling them towards the ground, whether you are grounded or not. The force will just change depending on if you are grounded or not. So this looks good. Now my character is definitely sticking to the ground and is not floating near where the check sphere is. Now if I jump off again just to test this one last time, you can see that yes, it does indeed play the falling animation, and upon landing it does indeed play the landing animation. Okay guys, so that is part one of this video. We still have to do a couple things to polish the aerial movement and the falling, and we also have to add the actual jumping functionality. Now when you're jumping and falling, you will be able to move the character, albeit just a little bit slower or a lot slower, but I'll make it so you're free to tweak that however you please. If you want full control of the character in the air, that is possible too. But I'm going to set it up like Elden Ring, because this what this series is, where we can move the character a little bit in the air very slowly. So, on the next episode, we are going to try to conclude this so we can jump around the scene and we can fall and move our character while they are in the air. As usual, I know I sound like a broken record, but if you guys made it this far, I would really appreciate a like and a comment on the series. It genuinely helps out the series so much you have no idea. And thank you, as always, my patrons. It really means the most that you guys choose to support me on that platform, and it's because of you guys I get to keep doing this, and I love doing this. So I will see you all next week. Have a wonderful week.